I'm Katy Cowan, and this is the Creative Boom Podcast. Our next guest is Tom Geismar, the acclaimed American graphic designer famous for creating some of the world's most recognisable and enduring brands. You've been in this business for quite a while, if you don't mind me saying. Your branding and design firm was established over 65 years ago in New York City, my gosh, with friends Ivan and Robert. I hope you don't mind me using everybody's first names. What are your standout memories from back then, when it was in such a very different world to the one we have today?
As you say, it was a very different world, a very small world, actually, in the graphic design world. I think almost everyone who was in it knew each other and were sort of friends, even though we were competing, we were personal friends and so on. So it was a very, very different time. And of course, very hands-on in terms of the work and so on. So also in that sense, it was a very, very different time.
Yeah, so much has changed since then. It was in an era really on the cusp of enormous cultural change. What did that feel like as graphic designers back then?
So we came together in 1958, and then the 60s. I mean, the late 50s and the 60s were a really incredibly tumultuous time, but also a very creative time. And it was just so influential and so great to be part of that. I mean, when I went to school, they did not have a course in graphic design. That was not something that was offered at that time. Today, it's become, I think, the most popular course in art schools certainly throughout the States. But at that time, there were very few art schools in graphic design. And it was only by chance that I ended up going to Yale for graduate school, where they had just started the school. I knew nothing about it, but a teacher at Rhode Island School of Design recommended I look into it. It basically changed my life. And at that time, the teachers were all the leading designers certainly in the U.S. So it was a special time. And then the 60s were so tumultuous. So many things happened in the world, and we were sort of part of that. And but it was a very tumultuous time, as is today, for sure.
Did you sort of realize you were going through such a kind of cultural shift? Did you see that sort of have an impact on the briefs that were coming through? That change from the sort of 50s innocence to the summer of love of the 60s?
When you're caught up in the middle of it, I'm not sure.
You don't really notice.
how where you are. It's just the world that you're dealing with. And it was exciting and, tumultuous. We were, lucky that it was the start of something in terms of design and graphics. So we were sort of, ahead of it. I mean, we were really on an exact path with, what is now Pentagram and Total Design. And
you were kind of pioneers then in that case, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say we were a second generation after those people I was describing as our teachers, incredible people who all were on their own. I think the thing that we did, which was unique, and I think it also just to an extent goes with Pentagram, is that we wanted to base the idea of our office on more of an architectural office. That's why we gave it our names rather than making up a name, which is a bit difficult for anyone to pronounce for years. But it was the idea of being a collaborative.
And it worked very well for you because, you and your friends, Ivan and Robert, you kind of went on to develop an agency that has lasted and built such a legacy ever since. How did you all work so well together? Were there ever any kind of disagreements, shall we say?
I think we did work well together. I think, I mean, fortunately, we always had a lot of work to do, even if it was nothing special. Um, so there were not disagreements, about things like that, and about work and about the office. We started out with one assistant, and then we had to get a couple more. So then we had to move. We went through changes. In our first offices, we were actually, our office was like a two-bedroom apartment, and I mean, it literally was. And he and I shared one of the rooms, and the desk was a big, hollow core door, 7 foot or 8 foot door up on uh, just some makeshift legs. And so he sat on one side of it, and I sat on the other side of it. And that for me was a great experience because BJ was so intense and so smart, and it was really a very eye-opening. Plus, working so closely with someone, which I had never done before, was for me a terrific experience. He did a famous book jacket, which was called "Passing Time," was the title of the book, and what he did, he used to sit there, be on the phone, he'd be smoking, and he'd be scribbling. I mean, just doing doodling. And when this project came in to do a book jacket, he just ripped off the paper he had been doodling on, and that became the jacket.
Wow.
For the book.
Very creative.
For passing time.
Yeah, that's a real New York story, isn't it? Of starting from very small to what you have now, and everything you've achieved along the way. That is a true New York story.
We've always tried to keep it fairly small so that we could have a very hands-on role in it, because we always wanted to design and not be administrators.
Yeah.
And to some extent, we've been able to do that, not consistently, but pretty much as possible. But it's been a goal, at least, to have that, not to get bigger than we could handle.
Yeah, it's very difficult to stay deliberately small. So how's it feel today compared to back then? Does it feel familiar to any moments over the years, or is today and what's happening unique, would you say?
And it's scary as it was back then. The difference, of course, is today everything is so much faster, and we know everything that's happening everywhere immediately, and which has good and certainly bad consequences.
Definitely. Does it impact your mental health, Tom? Is mental health something that's completely new to you, compared to sort of, your younger years when you were working in that office with your friend, working from a door?
Still working full time, I find I can concentrate on what I'm doing and what our issues are, our local issues, and avoid things we have no control over. So being busy has really made it possible to live a reasonable life. Plus, this place that we moved to, for temporarily at least, is quite lovely, and go out and take a walk, and the ocean is 10-minute walk away, and beautiful beach and whatever. So
Sounds lovely.
It's a much calmer than the city.
I'm smiling because I hope you don't mind me saying, but you are in your 90s now. Is that right?
Yeah, 91.
Oh, good grief. You don't look it, Tom. I think part of your secret is that you've carried on working and keeping yourself active. But It just makes me laugh because there's so many people here in the UK leaving cities to go to the countryside, and they're just in their sort of third decade of life, whereas you've just only escaped the hustle and bustle. Um, would you, in that case, say you're a city boy?
Well, I didn't grow up in the city, and
Mm.
but uh, ever since I got out of the army and joined Ivan and Brown John, I lived in the city, and I liked living in the city. And uh, I'm married, and we had three children, and they all grew up in the city. Of course, none of them now live in the city. Um, and no, I like the city very much, and we live right a block away from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I love going there. And it's all the cultural things in the city are great, as long as you can make use of it. And I've always thought it'd be a great place to retire to. No, for us, it's worked well, but this has also worked well in these past few years, given the circumstances.
You got the best of both worlds. And I'm sure you'll probably be back in the city very soon.
This weekend,
Brilliant. So we'll talk about your work now, Tom. I mean, obviously you've designed hundreds of logos, and this is probably a question you get asked many times, but are there any that stand out to you that are particular favourites, or is that just impossible to answer?
the ones people always name and talk about are ones that have become famous or they've done well. It doesn't mean they were necessarily the best designs or whatever, but it's just life
Hmm.
that way. And when you ask people, for example, what they think is a really good logo, they'll always talk about entities that they respect. The Apple is good, Nike is good, and whatever. Um, they'll never say Enron, for example. Enron had a great logo that Paul Rand did for them, but the company is a disaster. And so people will never say that was a good logo. I mean, so it's very hard to separate them. But in the same way, personally, it is. So for me, the one that had the most meaning was what we did for mobile oil. But that's because um, we spent, I think it was 35 years as their official design consultants and were very much an integral part of everything they did in terms of design and art. Ivan did many uh, posters and things for the cultural events that they were uh, sponsoring, which they did for many, many years. Uh, we were in charge of their buying and placing art in all their offices around the world.
Wow.
Uh, and that ended up being thousands of things, really, over the years. And I was in charge of all the design for the service stations and packaging and whatever. And it was a very close relationship. We made a lot of friends there. Uh, Again, it was a very different time. Uh, all the people we dealt with over the years, and there were, I don't know, probably hundreds, every one of them had spent their entire career there. Uh,
Good grief.
Today, that's completely unheard of,
That really is.
but that was the case. And there was a culture there that uh, they respected us and we respected them. And so it was a really meaningful experience when they were, I don't know, bought out or merged with Exxon in 1995. That was the end of our relationship. And that Exxon apparently had a completely different culture
Mm. It's all about
than
people, isn't it?
well, it's people, and there are different cultures, and they're usually determined from the top
Yeah.
down. So today, I know the oil and gas companies are um, question, but I always wondered what would have happened with mobile if they had stayed separate from Exxon
Yeah, that's
in
interesting.
these times. Yeah.
One of those questions that haunts you. So
Yeah.
are there any kind of you regret? Or is that too dangerous a question for you, Tom?
At the time, there was a whole cultural exchange program between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Right.
And we were asked to help and get the AIGA, American Institute of Graphic Arts, to put together an exhibit of American graphic arts. It turned out to be the most popular exhibit that the U.S. ever did. And it was interesting. I mean, it was so popular because all we did was show, for example, 100 book covers, a lot of record album covers. We showed packaging. I mean, very, very mundane in a sense things, but people in the Soviet Union had never seen these things. And we have photos of people waiting in line for hours in the snow
Oh,
to see this exhibit. But it also got us interested in the idea of exhibition design and using graphics and communication in exhibition format. So we ended up um, being the exhibit designers for the United States Government Pavilion at the World's Fair in Montreal, 1967, and then in Osaka, Japan in 1970, which were great experiences. I mean, they were, to me, were really exciting. But to do those, you needed a fairly large staff. And so we ended up in the 80s and 90s with, 35, almost 40 people at times, including historians, writers, um, uh, people to do mechanical drawings, and so on and so forth. Ivan especially disliked, or he felt he was losing control when we did these large projects with so many people and so on. So we essentially decided to split up our office at that point, uh, finally in 2005, and that we would just do graphics, and a lot of the people who were associates and so on in the firm who were doing exhibition design and so on would form their own firm, which they have to this day, and they're very successful,
great.
which they call C&G Associates. Um, and that we would just stick to something that we could have a very small office, and that we could easily control. So my regret is not having those projects, which I found extremely interesting. Um, the exhibition things and the research and so on that went into it.
That's really interesting to hear you sort of talk through the kind of learning that went through that era. And yeah, it's sad that we have to sometimes let these things go to open up other doors elsewhere. So how do you think, Tom, logo design has changed in, say, oh gosh, even just the past decade? Because today it relates to, say, design systems, much larger design systems that companies are now embracing. Is it that it's more than just a single great logo these days?
The big thing now is it has to work as an app. It has to work at tiny sizes on your phone and whatever. But well, we never knew what an app was or what an iPhone was or anything. We always tried to do things that were really simple that could work at in different sizes, different scales, if you will, and different materials. Um, that was always important to us. And so something like the Chase Bank logo, works perfectly in this medium. For us, it really hasn't changed that much. And we often will show a whole page, let's say for a new client, a page of, maybe 2 dozen logos that we've done. And then we'll put the dates that they were done. And the dates could be last week or 50 years ago.
Good grief.
And, they're obviously different one from the other, but not in terms of how they work. What you have to design for is very different, but not the idea of design systems. That I think has always, not always, but certainly since the 60s and so on, has been part of that, um, very much a part of it. It's just the particular issues are different today.
Definitely. And have evolved.
Yeah.
Speaking of technology, it's obviously changed quite a bit throughout your profession. Do you embrace it, or do you pine for what was perhaps before?
I think the most important part of the technology is a pencil and paper, and that hasn't changed. Today, it's so much easier to show. I mean, one thing we do when we're designing logos and things is we try to show not just the logo. We never just want to show the logo, but to show how it works. And we do a lot of testing of that ourselves to see how it works in various applications, and often throw it out because it's not working. It's really the only test. So it used to be quite difficult to do those things. If we're showing a letterhead, we'd have to actually make kind of a letterhead, paste it up, or anything more complicated was even more so. Or if you're going to show how it would work on a glass door or something, you'd have to get a piece of glass and get someone to etch it and so on. Today, it's, we can do all of it in Photoshop and whatever. So we're able to show many more examples of how something might work and to show it more effectively. So that's been great. The thing that is slightly not uh, a regret, I guess is to say, is all the services that we all used to use have all gone by the boards pretty much.
Mm.
You would send out, if you needed typeset, you would send it out. The typesetters would work overnight, and in the morning on your desk would be proofs of what you had set. If you needed an image, you'd have to send it out to a photostat shop for them to do it. So on and so forth. The printers, we worked closely with the printers because everything was printed, and you knew all the printers and knew what they could do and what they specialized in, and paper suppliers. I mean, it was a whole world of graphic arts suppliers and colleagues and so on, almost all of whom are now no longer. Uh,
Sad how
yeah,
it
yeah,
disrupts the industry. It changes jobs. It makes things redundant. And you've often seen that happen during your career, I'm sure, where new tech's been introduced and it causes this impact. It threatens creativity. With that in mind, Tom, what do you think makes a great designer?
I've found that all the really good designers that I know are also very bright, um, and they may work very differently, and their work may look very different. Uh, but whether they're designers or illustrators or um, typographers or whatever, there's an intelligence that comes about, and that's why I think it's a really interesting profession for young people to think about, not as stylists so much, even though I guess that applies in certain areas, but it's challenging and continually different. The challenges are different.
Definitely. Where are you focused on? What are you focused on right now, Tom? What are you excited about in the next sort of year?
Staying healthy and being able to continue doing
Like the
what
Bee
I'm doing,
Gees.
like the Bee Gees. Yes.
Well, you kind of, I think, it would be an insult to ask you why you've never felt the need to retire. I think you kind of answered that question previously when we were talking about mental health. I mean, do you feel like you would get bored if you sort of hung your pencil and paper up?
Yes.
is the simple answer.
I've also seen so many people who, after retiring, looking forward to it and for 6 months saying it's so great, and then pretty much disintegrating. Especially men, who have led very busy lives and suddenly have to think of reasons to go to the store to buy a loaf of bread or something just to keep busy. For someone who has many other interests and can stay active with those, it can be great. I guess it depends on your personality, but I find to be continually engaged. One of the things that we do, for example, in our projects, which we've always done, but even more so now, is to start out, we interview a lot of people. And we're working in many different fields. I mean, our clients are from many different areas. I find that really interesting. And the discussions are not about design. We're trying to understand the culture and the issues of why we've been brought in here. So there are a lot of things in the medical field and other fields and inventions and aviation and so on that I find very interesting. So it keeps you interested.
Oh, definitely. You've chosen the perfect industry. I mean, I hope you don't mind me saying so, Tom, but you've had 16 presidents in your lifetime. And
16? Wow.
16 from Hoover to Roosevelt. Oh, no, since so sorry, you started off with Hoover and Roosevelt, and here we are today with Biden.
Yeah.
Gosh, 16. Wow.
And you've only had one queen.
I know. That's so true. Bless her. Do you ever think about leaving a legacy yourself, or is that something you try not to think about?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, well, I think this has been lovely, Tom, and I just want to thank you for chatting through some of your career highlights today and where your head's at. Before we go, do you have any advice that you want to share with younger designers who maybe want to stand out in what has become a very crowded sector?
Well, it has become extremely crowded, but it's also, enlarged. I mean, the scope of it has enlarged. So I would think that the same qualities and abilities and everything will allow you to stand out if you really, really enjoy it and you really work hard at it. I just think now there are so many more avenues and opportunities that go for it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Tom.
Thanks, Katy. Nice talking to you.
To discover more about Tom Geismar, you can find everything you need via our show notes at creativeboom.com/podcast. That's where you can also hit subscribe and see our entire archive of episodes so far.